I died and met St. Peter, the shocking truth about Jesus and the future. My name is David Miller, and until recently, I was about as ordinary as they come. 42 years old, divorced, working as a mid-level accountant for a mid-sized firm in Des Moines, Iowa. My life revolved around spreadsheets, tax returns, and the occasional awkward weekend visit with my teenage daughter, Sarah. I wasn't particularly religious. I went to church on Christmas and Easter, mostly to appease my mother, but God was more of an abstract concept than a daily presence in my life. My days were predictable, a comfortable routine that I both appreciated and resented. Wake up at 6:30, coffee, toast, check the news, mostly sports and the stock market, drive to work, crunch numbers, eat lunch at my desk, crunch more numbers, drive home, microwave dinner, watch TV, go to bed, repeat. My social life was minimal. I had a few work buddies I'd grab a beer with occasionally, but no close friends. My marriage had ended 5 years earlier, amicably enough, but it left a void I hadn't quite managed to fill. I dated sporadically, with limited success. Online dating felt like a second job, and I was already working overtime at my first. I wasn't unhappy, exactly, just unfulfilled. I felt like I was going through the motions, living a life that was somehow both comfortable and deeply unsatisfying. I had vague aspiration of doing something more, but I never quite figured out what that something was. I was drifting, carried along by the current of everyday life, with no particular destination in mind. My biggest concern, most days, was whether the Iowa Hawkeyes would make it to the Rose Bowl. My biggest philosophical dilemma was whether to order pepperoni or sausage on my pizza. I was, in short, a perfectly average American, living a perfectly average life. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was driving home from work, stuck in the usual rush hour traffic. I was listening to the radio, half-heartedly singing along to an 80s rock song, when a truck swerved into my lane. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. There was a deafening screech of tires, a blinding flash of metal, and then nothing. I didn't feel any pain. One moment, I was in my car. The next, I was somewhere else. It wasn't a place, exactly, not in the way I understood places. It was more like a state of being. I was surrounded by a soft, diffuse light, a gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a sense of profound peace, a calmness I had never experienced before. All my worries, all my anxieties, all my regrets, they simply vanished. I felt weightless, unburdened, free. I wasn't alone. I sensed a presence nearby, a feeling of being watched, but not in a threatening way. It was a comforting presence, a welcoming presence. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but I had no body, at least not in the physical sense. I was pure consciousness, pure awareness, floating in a void of infinite peace. I wasn't afraid. I knew, somehow, that I was dead, but death wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't darkness, it wasn't oblivion. It was this strange, beautiful, ineffable nothingness. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A gate. Not just any gate, but the gate. It shimmered and glowed, radiating a light that was both powerful and gentle. It was made of something that looked like gold, but it was also translucent, as if it were made of pure light. As I drifted closer, I saw a figure standing before the gate. A man, tall and imposing, with a long white beard and kind, piercing eyes. He wore robes that seemed to be woven from the same light that emanated from the gate. He smiled at me, a warm, welcoming smile that filled me with a sense of profound love and acceptance. "Welcome, David," he said, his voice a gentle rumble that resonated within me. "I am Peter." The shock of hearing my name, spoken by this being in this place, was immense. Even in this state of disembodied consciousness, I felt a jolt, a surge of something akin to adrenaline. Peter, as in St. Peter? The Sunday school stories, the stained glass windows, the half-remembered sermons. It all came flooding back. This couldn't be real, could it? You're St. Peter, I managed to ask, the thought forming in my awareness and somehow reaching him. I didn't speak, not with a mouth, but the communication was clear. He nodded, his smile unwavering. "Indeed, I am the keeper of this gate." I looked at the gate again. It was even more magnificent up close. Intricate carvings, symbols I couldn't quite decipher, seemed to shift and change in the light. It pulsed with a gentle energy, a living force that hummed with power. This is the gate to heaven?" I asked, the concept still struggling to find purchase in my post-life mind. My previous understanding of heaven was vague, childish, clouds, angels, harps. This was different. It is a gate, Peter corrected gently. There are many paths, many entrances. This is but one. He gestured with a hand, and a section of the gate shimmered, becoming transparent. I could see, not a landscape of clouds and winged beings, but a vast, swirling expanse of light and color. It was breathtaking, indescribable. It felt like looking into the heart of creation itself. So am I going in? I asked, a flicker of hope, or was it fear stirring within me? I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever that was. Peter's expression softened. Not yet, David. There is something you must know, something you must understand. He turned and faced me fully, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that was both unnerving and comforting. The time is near, he said. The prophecies are coming to pass. I frowned, or at least, I felt the sensation of frowning, even without a face. Prophecies. What prophecies? The prophecies of the return, Peter said. The return of the Christ. My mind reeled. The second coming. This was getting seriously theological, far beyond my usual Tuesday night concerns. I'd always thought of the second coming as a distant, vaguely apocalyptic event, something that would happen someday. Not now, not to me. He's coming back, I stammered. He is already here, Peter said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a profound secret. He walks among you, in the land you call America. This was too much. My accountant brain, even in its disembodied state, was struggling to process this information. Jesus, in America. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. But why? How? I managed to ask. Peter smiled again, a patient, understanding smile. He has a mission, a purpose, a plan that has been in motion for millennia. He paused, then continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. But the world is not yet ready for his full revelation. There are trials ahead, great tribulations that must be endured. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. And you, David, have a part to play. Me? What could I possibly do? I was a dead accountant from Iowa. I was about as far from a prophet or a hero as one could get. I don't understand, I said. You will, Peter said. But first, you must know the truth. Peter gestured again, and the swirling colors beyond the gate shifted, forming into images. It was like watching a movie projected onto the fabric of reality itself, a vision unfolding before my non-existent eyes. I saw scenes of chaos and destruction, cities in flames, people fleeing in terror, armies clashing. It was a vision of war, of a scale and intensity I had never imagined. This is what is to come, Peter said, his voice grave. A great conflict, a war that will engulf the world. I recoiled, a feeling of dread washing over me. World War III? I asked, the words barely a whisper. Peter nodded. It has been foretold. A time of great suffering, a time of testing. The images shifted, focusing on a specific region, a land of lush green rice paddies, ancient temples, and bustling cities. I recognized it, vaguely, from news reports and documentaries. Indochina, Peter said. This region will be at the center of the storm. A second conflict will erupt, a crucible of fire that will purify and prepare the way. I was struggling to keep up. World War III, a war in Indochina, and Jesus was somehow involved in all of this? It was too much to take in. But where does Jesus fit into all of this? I asked, my mind racing. You said he was in America. Peter nodded. He is, living among you, unknown, unrecognized, preparing for what? For his return to Vietnam, Peter said, the words dropping like stones into the silence. I stared at him, uncomprehending. Vietnam? Why Vietnam? Peter smiled, a knowing smile. It is a land of ancient wisdom, a land that has endured great suffering, a land with a deep spiritual connection. It is a place of hidden power, a place of refuge, a place of becoming. He continued, after the wars, after the chaos, after the world has been brought to its knees, he will reveal himself. He will establish a nation in Vietnam, a kingdom of peace and righteousness. I was speechless. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was a complete upheaval of everything I thought I knew about religion, about history, about the world. But why not just reveal himself now? I asked. Why wait for all the suffering? Peter sighed. Humanity is not ready. It is blinded by greed, by hatred, by materialism. It must be humbled, broken, before it can be rebuilt. The wars are a necessary evil, a painful cleansing, He stressed the word necessary. He looked at me, his eyes filled with compassion. It is not a punishment, David. It is a consequence of the choices humanity has made. But even in the darkest of times, there is hope. There is always hope. He paused, then added, and after the wars, after the suffering, the world will turn to him. They will seek him out. They will come to Vietnam, from every corner of the globe, seeking peace, seeking truth, seeking salvation. They will become his subjects, I asked, the idea still sounding utterly foreign. They will find refuge in his kingdom, Peter corrected gently. They will learn to live in harmony, in accordance with the divine law. It will be a new era, an era of peace and prosperity. The vision ended, the swirling colors faded, and I was once again facing Peter, standing before the shimmering gate. This is the truth, David, he said. This is what you must know. This is what you must share. I was overwhelmed, terrified, and strangely exhilarated. I had been given a glimpse of the future, a glimpse of the divine plan, and the first, an ordinary accountant from Iowa, had been chosen to play a part in it. But how? What was I supposed to do? You must return, Peter said, answering my unspoken question. You must tell others what you have seen and heard. I recoiled. Return. But I'm dead. Peter smiled. Death is not the end, David. It is merely a transition. You have been given a glimpse beyond the veil, a glimpse of the truth. Now, you must go back and share that truth with the world. I was terrified. I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay in this place of peace, this place of understanding. The thought of returning to my ordinary life, with all its anxieties and uncertainties, filled me with dread, especially with this new, monumental burden. But no one will believe me, I protested. They'll think I'm crazy. Some will, Peter said. Some will not. But that is not your concern. Your concern is to speak the truth, to plant the seeds of faith. The rest is in God's hands. He placed a hand on my non-existent shoulder, and I felt a surge of warmth and strength flow through me. Do not be afraid, David, he said. You are not alone. You will be guided. You will be protected. He then elaborated further on the prophecy, filling in more details about the coming conflicts. He emphasized that the wars were not random acts of violence, but part of a larger, divinely ordained plan. World War III, he explained, will be a conflict unlike any seen before. It will be a war of ideologies, a war of technologies, a war that will threaten the very existence of humanity. He didn't name specific nations or political leaders. He spoke in broad terms, focusing on the underlying causes of the conflict: greed, hatred, the lust for power, the rejection of spiritual values. It will be a time of great darkness, he said, a time of fear and despair, but it will also be a time of awakening, a time for humanity to choose a different path. He then spoke of the Indochina War, describing it as a more localized but equally intense conflict. He said it would be a crucible of fire, a testing ground that would prepare Vietnam for its role as a spiritual sanctuary. This conflict will be different, he explained. It will be a war for the soul of a nation, a struggle between light and darkness. It will be a time of great suffering, but also a time of great heroism and sacrifice. He emphasized that the Indochina War was not simply a political or military conflict, but a spiritual battle, a necessary step in the unfolding of the divine plan. He didn't glorify war. He presented it as a tragic, but unavoidable consequence of human choices. The suffering will be immense, Peter said, his voice filled with sorrow, but it will pave the way for a new era of peace and understanding. It will cleanse the land, preparing it for the arrival of the King. He stressed that the outcome of these wars was not predetermined. Humanity still had free will. The choices people made, individually and collectively, would determine the ultimate outcome. The wars are a warning, Peter said, a wake-up call, a chance for humanity to turn back to God, to embrace love, to choose peace. He looked at me intently. Your task, David, is to help people understand this, to help them see the truth behind the chaos, to offer them hope in the midst of despair. I felt a heavy weight of responsibility settle upon me. It was a daunting task, an overwhelming burden, but I also felt a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that I was being called to something greater than myself. I'll try, I said, my voice trembling. Peter smiled. That is all that is asked of you. Trust in God, David. Trust in the divine plan, and trust in yourself. He gestured towards the gate, and the swirling colors began to fade. The light grew dimmer. The sense of peace began to recede. It is time for you to return, he said. Go now and speak the truth. Be a voice of hope in a world of darkness. I felt a pulling sensation, a sense of being drawn back, away from the gate, away from the light. I wanted to stay, to ask more questions, to understand more fully. But it was too late. I was falling, tumbling, spiraling back into the darkness. The last thing I saw was Peter's kind, compassionate face, and the last thing I heard was his voice, echoing in my mind. Remember, David, the future is not fixed. It is in your hands. Then, everything went black. Before sending me back, Peter elaborated on why Vietnam was chosen as the place of Jesus' eventual return and the establishment of his kingdom. It wasn't presented as a political statement or an endorsement of any particular regime, but rather as a confluence of spiritual and historical factors. Vietnam, Peter explained, has a long and complex history, a history marked by both immense suffering and extraordinary resilience. He showed me images, not of war this time, but of the land itself, emerald rice paddies stretching to the horizon, ancient temples hidden in misty mountains, the vibrant colors of traditional clothing, the faces of the people, etched with both hardship and a quiet strength. For centuries, Peter continued, Vietnam has been a crossroads of cultures, a meeting place of East and West. It has been invaded, colonized, and divided, yet it has always maintained its unique identity, its spirit unbroken. He emphasized the enduring influence of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism on Vietnamese culture, creating a foundation of spiritual values that, despite the turmoil of the 20th century, still resonated deeply within the people. The Vietnamese people, Peter said, have a deep understanding of suffering, of impermanence, of the interconnectedness of all things. They have learned to find peace in the midst of chaos, to find strength in the face of adversity. He explained that the Indochina War, while devastating, would ultimately serve to further purify the land and its people, preparing them for their role as a spiritual sanctuary. The war will be a crucible, he said, repeating the term he had used before. It will test their faith, their resilience, their compassion, but it will also forge them into something new, something stronger, something holy. He described Vietnam as a seedbed of enlightenment, a place where the seeds of a new consciousness would be sown, nurtured, and eventually spread throughout the world. It is not about geographical location, David, Peter clarified. It is about the spiritual landscape. Vietnam, through its history and its people, has cultivated a unique spiritual energy, a resonance that makes it the ideal place for this new beginning. He compared it to the role of Israel in the Old Testament, a chosen land, not because of any inherent superiority, but because of its spiritual significance in the divine plan. It is a place of refuge, Peter said, a place where people from all nations will come to find peace, to find healing, to find truth. It will be a model for a new world, a world based on love, compassion, and understanding. He emphasized that this kingdom would not be a political entity in the traditional sense. It would not be about conquest or domination, but about spiritual transformation. It will be a kingdom of the heart, Peter said, a kingdom of consciousness, a kingdom of love. He showed me a final vision, a glimpse of this future Vietnam. I saw a land bathed in golden light, a place of breathtaking beauty and tranquility. I saw people from all races and backgrounds living together in harmony, their faces radiant with joy and peace. I saw a world transformed, a world healed, a world united in spirit. It was a vision of hope, a vision of possibility, a vision that filled me with a profound sense of longing. It was a vision that I knew I had to share with the world. This vision, and the preceding explanation, provided the crucial why behind the seemingly arbitrary choice of Vietnam, grounding it in a spiritual, rather than political, context. It made the prophecy more believable within the fictional framework, and gave the narrator a deeper understanding of his mission. The sensation of returning to my body was even more jarring than leaving it. It was like being slammed into a brick wall, a sudden, brutal re-entry into the world of physical sensation. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my heart pounding erratically. I felt a sharp, throbbing pain in my head, and a dull ache throughout my body. I was lying on the pavement, surrounded by a crowd of people. I could hear sirens wailing in the distance, the shouts of onlookers, the crunch of broken glass underfoot. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the air. My car was a mangled wreck, a twisted heap of metal and shattered glass. The truck that had hit me was several yards away, its front end crumpled. It was a miracle I was alive. He's awake, someone shouted. He's breathing. Faces loomed over me, blurry and indistinct. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and my voice wouldn't cooperate. I felt a wave of nausea, and I closed my eyes, trying to block out the chaos. Paramedics arrived, their movements swift and efficient. They strapped me to a stretcher, loaded me into an ambulance, and rushed me to the hospital. The next few hours were a blur of tests, x-rays, and examinations. I was diagnosed with a concussion, several broken ribs, and a multitude of cuts and bruises. But miraculously, there were no life-threatening injuries. As I lay in the hospital bed, the memories of my near-death experience came flooding back. The gate, Peter, the prophecy, the vision of Vietnam. It all seemed so vivid, so real. But was it? Doubt began to creep in. The doctors had attributed my experience to oxygen deprivation, a common explanation for NDEs. They said the brain could play strange tricks when it was starved of oxygen, creating vivid hallucinations that felt incredibly real. I wanted to believe, I needed to believe, that what I had experienced was real, but the rational, scientific part of my brain was screaming at me to be skeptical. I was an accountant, after all, a man of logic and reason. I dealt with numbers, facts, tangible evidence, not visions and prophecies. I told the doctors and nurses about my experience, but they dismissed it as a hallucination, a side effect of the trauma. They were kind, understanding, but ultimately unconvinced. I felt utterly alone, isolated by this incredible secret I was carrying. I couldn't talk to my family, my friends, my ex-wife. They would think I was crazy. They would put me in a psychiatric ward. I was torn between two worlds, the world of everyday reality, the world of spreadsheets and traffic jams and hospital bills, and the world of spiritual revelation, the world of divine prophecies and a coming kingdom of peace. I struggled to reconcile these two realities, to find a way to integrate my experience into my ordinary life. I felt like I was living a double life, pretending to be the same old David Miller, while secretly harboring this earth-shattering knowledge. The doubt gnawed at me. Was I delusional? Was I losing my mind? Or had I truly been given a glimpse of the future, a glimpse of the divine plan? I needed answers. I needed proof. I needed something, anything, to confirm that what I had experienced was real. I decided that I had to find out more. I had to investigate. I had to seek confirmation, wherever it might lead. I had to find out if Jesus was really living in America, preparing to return to Vietnam. It was a crazy idea, a ludicrous quest, but I couldn't shake it. It was the only thing that gave my life meaning, the only thing that made sense of the chaos I had witnessed, both in my vision and in the wreckage of my car. I was discharged from the hospital a week later, still bruised and battered, but determined to find the truth. My ordinary life was over. My extraordinary journey had begun. My search began online. I spent hours, days, poring over websites, articles, and forums, searching for any mention of Jesus living in America. I found plenty of fringe conspiracy theories, self-proclaimed prophets, and end-of-the-world cults, but nothing that felt credible, nothing that resonated with my experience. I researched Vietnamese history, culture, and religion, trying to understand why that particular country had been chosen as the future kingdom. I learned about the country's long struggle for independence, its rich spiritual traditions, its resilience in the face of adversity, but I still couldn't find any concrete connection to Jesus. I visited churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples, seeking guidance from religious leaders. I spoke to priests, rabbis, imams, and Buddhist monks, sharing my story carefully edited to avoid sounding completely insane, and asking for their insights. Some were sympathetic, offering prayers and words of encouragement. Others were skeptical, dismissing my experience as a hallucination or a delusion. A few were downright hostile, accusing me of blasphemy or heresy. I even considered traveling to Vietnam, but I realized that I had no idea where to start, who to talk to, or what to look for. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, a continent-sized haystack. My frustration grew. I was hitting dead ends at every turn. The doubt that had started as a whisper was now a roar in my head. Was I chasing a phantom? Was I wasting my time? Was I simply losing my grip on reality? I started to question my own sanity. I considered seeking psychiatric help, wondering if I was suffering from some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, some kind of delusion brought on by the accident. But then, I had a breakthrough. I stumbled upon a small, obscure website dedicated to interfaith dialogue and spiritual exploration. It wasn't a flashy site, filled with sensational claims or end-of-the-world prophecies. It was a quiet, thoughtful space for people of different faiths to share their experiences and perspectives. I posted my story on the forum, carefully worded to avoid sounding too outlandish. I described my near-death experience, my encounter with St. Peter, and the prophecy of Jesus' return to Vietnam. I didn't ask for proof, I simply asked for guidance, for any insights that might help me understand my experience. Most of the responses were the usual mix of skepticism and well-wishing, but one response stood out. It was from a user named Sophia77. She didn't claim to have any definitive answers, but she offered a different perspective, a different way of looking at the prophecy. The return of Christ, she wrote, may not be a literal, physical return. It may be a symbolic return, a return of the Christ consciousness, a return to the core teachings of love, compassion, and forgiveness. She suggested that the kingdom of peace in Vietnam might not be a political entity, but a spiritual community, a place where people from all over the world could come to learn and grow, to heal and transform. She also pointed out that the prophecy spoke of wars preceding the return, suggesting that these conflicts might be symbolic as well, representing the internal struggles, the spiritual battles that we all face in our own lives. Her words resonated with me deeply. They offered a new way of understanding my experience, a way that felt both intellectually satisfying and spiritually profound. It didn't provide the concrete proof I was seeking, but it gave me a new direction, a new framework for my search. It shifted my focus from the literal to the symbolic, from the external to the internal. I realized that the true meaning of the prophecy might not be found in some hidden location in America or Vietnam, but within myself, within the hearts and minds of all humanity. The search for Jesus, I realized, was ultimately a search for the divine within, and that was a journey I could embark on, no matter where I was. I continued my search, now with a renewed sense of purpose and a broader perspective. I delved deeper into the study of comparative religion, exploring the common threads that connected the world's great spiritual traditions. I practiced meditation, seeking to quiet my mind and connect with my inner self. I volunteered at a local homeless shelter, trying to embody the principles of love and compassion that Sophia77 had spoken of. Then, the news started to change. At first, it was just subtle shifts, a growing sense of unease in the global political climate. Tensions between nations escalated, diplomatic efforts failed, and the rhetoric of war became more frequent and more strident. Then, it happened. A series of coordinated terrorist attacks, on a scale never before seen, rocked major cities around the world. Thousands were killed, economies were thrown into chaos, and a wave of fear and panic swept across the globe. This was followed by retaliatory strikes, military mobilizations, and a rapid escalation of hostilities. Within weeks, the world was at war. It wasn't the kind of war one had grown up learning about in history books. It wasn't about conquering territory or seizing resources. It was a war of ideologies, a war of narratives, a war fought as much in cyberspace as on the battlefield. Nuclear weapons were not used, at least not initially, but the conventional warfare was devastating enough. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were displaced, and the global economy teetered on the brink of collapse. I watched in horror as the prophecy, or at least my initial interpretation of it, began to unfold. The world was descending into chaos, just as St. Peter had foretold. I felt a mixture of dread and confirmation. My near-death experience, once a source of doubt and confusion, now seemed eerily prescient. I was no longer a skeptic, but a witness. I continued my spiritual practice, finding solace in meditation and prayer. I doubled my efforts at the homeless shelter, finding a sense of purpose in serving others. I tried to share my message of hope with those around me, but most people were too consumed by fear and anxiety to listen. The war raged on, month after month, with no end in sight. The news was a constant barrage of death and destruction, a grim reminder of humanity's capacity for self-annihilation. I began to wonder if I had misinterpreted the prophecy. Perhaps the kingdom of peace was not meant to be a physical place, but a state of being, a spiritual awakening that would occur after the destruction, not before. I clung to the hope that Sophia77's interpretation was correct, that the return of Christ was a symbolic return, a return to the core principles of love, compassion, and forgiveness. But even if that were true, the suffering was real, the pain was palpable, and the future looked bleak. The world was in darkness, and I, a small, insignificant voice in the wilderness, could only pray for the dawn. The war was not just out there, it was impacting everything, even in Des Moines. Supply chains were disrupted, Prices soared, and fear was a constant companion. As World War III raged on, a separate, more localized conflict erupted in Southeast Asia. It started with a series of border skirmishes, escalating rapidly into a full-blown war involving several countries in the region. The news media dubbed it the Indochina War, echoing the conflicts of the 20th century. This war, while smaller in scale than the global conflict, was arguably even more brutal, more intense. It was fought not only with conventional weapons, but also with a ferocity fueled by ancient rivalries, ethnic tensions, and religious extremism. I watched the news with a growing sense of dread, remembering St. Peter's words, "This region will be at the center of the storm. A second conflict will erupt, a crucible of fire that will purify and prepare the way." The Indochina War was not widely reported in the Western media, overshadowed by the larger global conflict. But I knew, from my vision, that this war was crucial, that it held a deeper significance. I focused my attention on Vietnam, the country that had been designated as the future kingdom of peace. I followed the news reports, the online forums, the blogs of aid workers and journalists on the ground. What I saw was heartbreaking. The war was devastating the country, destroying its infrastructure, displacing its population, and inflicting unimaginable suffering on its people. But amidst the chaos and destruction, I also saw signs of hope. I read stories of incredible resilience, of communities coming together to support one another, of acts of kindness and compassion in the face of unimaginable cruelty. I saw Buddhist monks risking their lives to provide shelter and aid to refugees. I saw doctors and nurses working tirelessly in makeshift hospitals, treating the wounded and comforting the dying. I saw ordinary citizens sharing their meager resources with those who had even less. It seemed that the very worst of humanity was being met with the very best. The crucible of fire was indeed forging something new, something stronger, something holy. I started to understand what St. Peter had meant by purification. It wasn't about divine punishment, but about the transformative power of suffering, the ability of extreme adversity to strip away the superficial and reveal the core of human goodness. The Indochina War, like World War III, dragged on for months, then years. The global community, preoccupied with its own problems, largely ignored the conflict, leaving the people of Southeast Asia to fend for themselves. Then, unexpectedly, the fighting stopped, not with a formal peace treaty, not with a clear victory for one side or the other, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible winding down of hostilities. The warring factions, exhausted and depleted, simply ceased fighting. There were no victory parades, no celebrations, just a weary, shell-shocked silence. The world, still reeling from the global conflict, barely noticed. But I knew that this was the turning point. This was the moment St. Peter had spoken of. The wars were over. The purification was complete. And somewhere, in the heart of America, a man was preparing to return to the land that had been prepared for him. The end of the wars did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. The world was shattered, scarred, and deeply traumatized. Millions were dead, economies were in ruins, and societies were fractured. But amidst the devastation, a new spirit began to emerge. A spirit of resilience, a spirit of cooperation, a spirit of hope. People began to realize that the old ways of conflict and competition were no longer sustainable. They began to search for a new way of living, a new way of relating to one another, a new way of being in the world. And then, the rumors started. Whispers, at first, circulating on the internet, in obscure blogs and forums. Stories of a holy man in Vietnam, a teacher, a healer, a leader who was gathering followers and preaching a message of peace, love, and unity. The stories were vague, fragmented, often contradictory. Some said he was a Buddhist monk, others a Christian mystic, others a Muslim imam. Some said he performed miracles, others that he was simply a wise and compassionate man. But one thing was consistent. He was in Vietnam, and he was drawing people to him from all over the world. I felt a stirring within me, a deep sense of recognition. This was it. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy. This was the return that St. Peter had spoken of. The mainstream media initially dismissed the rumors as the fantasies of war-weary populations seeking solace in myth and legend. But as more and more people traveled to Vietnam, drawn by the stories, the media could no longer ignore it. Reports began to filter out, cautious at first, then increasingly astonished. Journalists, aid workers, and even former soldiers who had fought in the Indochina War were returning from Vietnam, with tales of a remarkable transformation. They spoke of a growing community, a haven of peace and tranquility. Centered around this enigmatic figure, they spoke of a new way of life, based on principles of sustainability, cooperation, and spiritual awakening. They spoke of a man who radiated love, compassion, and wisdom, a man who seemed to embody the very essence of the divine. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the man St. Peter had told me about. This was Jesus, returned not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet humility, ready to guide humanity towards a new era. I felt a powerful, irresistible call to go to Vietnam. It wasn't a logical decision, it was a spiritual imperative. I had to see him, to hear him, to learn from him. I quit my job, sold my belongings, and said goodbye to my daughter, Sarah. She didn't understand, of course. She thought I was crazy, a victim of post-traumatic stress, a follower of some strange cult. But she also saw the change in me, the peace and purpose that had replaced my former anxiety and emptiness. She saw my conviction, my unwavering belief, and she, reluctantly, gave me her blessing. I booked a one-way ticket to Hanoi. I had no plan, no contacts, no idea what awaited me. I only had faith, hope, and a burning desire to be a part of this new beginning. As the plane took off, I looked out the window at the receding city lights, a mixture of sadness and excitement churning within me. I was leaving behind my old life, my old identity, my old world. I was embarking on a journey into the unknown, a journey to the heart of a new world, a journey to the kingdom of peace. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would ever see my daughter again. I didn't know if I would even find the man I was seeking. But I knew that I was on the right path. I knew that I was following my heart, my soul, my destiny. And as the plane soared into the night sky, heading towards the rising sun, I felt a sense of profound peace, a feeling that I was finally home. I was going to Vietnam, not to find a man, but to find myself, to find my place in the unfolding of the divine plan. The meeting itself was unimportant. The journey and the awakening it represented was everything.